Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about the cost to build a tiny house. Now, I know this is something that a lot of people are curious about because tiny houses have recently exploded in popularity. But the truth is, the cost to build a tiny house varies greatly depending on a number of factors. Let's explore those factors together, including size, materials, location, and complexity. I'll also share with you some tips on how to save money and also give you a breakdown of what it cost us to build our tiny house. So stay tuned and let's get started. One of the biggest factors that goes into the cost of building a tiny house is the size. Now, tiny houses are small to begin with, but costs can vary greatly depending on the size tiny house you build. There is a difference between, say, a tiny house that is 100 square feet versus 200 square feet. Of course, you want to make sure that you have enough space for all your needs, but at the same time, if you go too big, it might make your tiny house a more expensive build. One tip is to look for ways to maximize the space of your tiny house. You can incorporate storage into your design. This will help you get more use out of the space you have without having to go bigger. Another tip is to be selective about the features and amenities you include in your tiny house. Think carefully about what you really need and what you can live without. Another factor that can have a big impact on the cost of your tiny house is the materials you choose. Now, you could decide to go all out and use high-end finishes, but keep in mind that that will increase the cost of your tiny house build. On the other hand, you can use basic materials and that will help you save money. So, what's the right balance? Well, honestly, it really depends on your personal preference and your budget. Some people are willing to spend a little bit more for quality material because they know that it'll pay off in the long run. Others are more focused on saving money and are okay sacrificing the quality in order to do so. A personal tip I have that we use in the build of our tiny house is we focused on putting quality materials in high traffic areas. For example, you might use a less expensive type of wood for the interior paneling instead of a more expensive option like shiplap. It really looks great. However, we chose to spend more money on our flooring and our countertops, which are used multiple times a day. There are all sorts of ways to save money on a tiny house build, from using recycled materials to finding alternative solutions to more expensive options. So don't be afraid to think outside the box and get creative. The location of where you choose to build your tiny house can also affect the cost. You may be building in an area that charges higher labor and higher material cost, but this is completely dependent on your personal situation. We actually did about 95% of the labor ourselves and also built our tiny house in Florida and also sourced our materials from Florida as well. Just keep this in mind when you're building your tiny house, that location does affect the cost of building your tiny house. Another factor that can impact the cost of your tiny house is the level of complexity. Now, I'm not talking about the complexity in the design itself, although that does have somewhat of an impact. What I'm talking more about here is the level of finish and detail in your tiny house. For example, if you're building a tiny house with a lot of custom features and a lot of high-end finishes, that's gonna drive up the cost compared to your basic no-frills build. So how do you keep things simple and cost-effective when you're designing your tiny house? It is very important to set a budget and, more importantly, stick to it. This will help you make informed decisions about what features and finishes you can realistically afford in your tiny house build. Now let's talk about labor. There are pros and cons to both when it comes to building your tiny house yourself versus hiring a contractor to do it for you. Building a tiny house yourself can be a time-consuming process, especially if you have limited building experience. Hiring a contractor may save you time, but it will add to the overall cost. Building a tiny house yourself can save you money on labor cost, but it may also require a larger upfront investment in local tools and materials. Hiring a contractor will likely be more expensive, but it will also come with a warranty or guarantee on the work. Make sure to factor in about 30 to 60% of your budget towards labor if you decide to hire a contractor. Building a tiny house requires a range of skills and knowledge, including carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work. If you have these skills and are comfortable tackling a complex building project, building yourself may be a good option. If you lack these skills or are unsure about your ability, hiring a contractor might be a safer choice. Okay, so now the fun one. Let's talk about budgeting. This is my favorite part. Budgeting for a tiny house can be a bit of a challenge, but with careful planning and a little bit of creativity, you can build a tiny house that fits your budget and also fits your needs. But where do you start? Step 1, set a budget. Determine how much you can realistically afford to spend on your tiny house build and stick to it. 2, identify cost. Make a list of all the costs associated with building a tiny house, including materials, labor. Also include financing and permits if it applies to you, and also any additional features or amenities. Number 3, plan for contingencies. Budget for unexpected expenses that may arise during the build, such as weather delays or a change of plans. Number 4, track your expenses. Keep track of your actual expenses as you build your tiny house so you can stay within your budget and make necessary adjustments. By following these tips, you can create a budget that will help you achieve your tiny house goals while also staying within your financial means. So now let's break down the cost of what we spent building our tiny house. So what I did is I looked at several examples, and then from that example budget, I adapted it to fit our budget and our needs. So let's look at the example first. We have a budget of about $30,000, which is about what we wanted to spend with our tiny house. The example gives us about a size of about 150 square feet. Material cost around $15,000, labor $9,000, financing $4,000, permits $1,000, and additional features $5,000. So this is the example budget that I followed, and then I tweaked it accordingly. So our budget was $30,000. We decided that we wanted our tiny house to be anywhere between 150 to 200 square feet. Our completed tiny house is 164 square feet. We actually decided to increase our material costs because we did want some higher end materials in certain key areas. Our labor costs were about $3,000, which is about half of the example labor. We did not hire a contractor to do all the work. Greg did about 95% of the labor himself. We hired out the welding and the general build out for the staircase kitchen build out. We also did not have to purchase plans because Greg and I designed the tiny house ourselves, and Greg's dad engineered the frame. Financing was $0 for us because we paid cash. Under permits is $0 for us because our intent from the very beginning was to travel in our tiny house. We actually built our tiny house on a trailer, so it's technically a tiny house on wheels. Now, we traveled around with it cross country to Montana.
Welcome to Montana.
I'm back again. Right now we are renting a lot while we look for land to put our tiny house on permanently. Then we'll have to run into permits. Under additional features, we gave ourselves a budget of $7,000. Now let's see what it actually costs us to build a tiny house based on our original budget. On materials, we spent $24,013. On labor, we actually spent $2,215. Financing was $0. Permits were $0 still. Additional features, we spent $6,711, which gives us a grand total of $32,939 to build our own tiny house. So we've talked about some of the main factors, including size, materials, location, and complexity, but there are also two other things that you need to consider, but again, this is completely dependent on your situation. Number 1 is you have to factor in financing. So if you don't have the cash on hand to do this, then financing is definitely an option for you. Also, depending on where you build your tiny house, you might have to get a variety of permits. These permits can come with fees, so that's important to factor into your overall cost of your tiny house build. Finally, don't forget about amenities. If you're building a tiny house with certain amenities like a kitchen and bathroom, which likely you're gonna have a kitchen or a bathroom in your tiny house, you'll need to budget for those as well. This can include things like appliances, plumbing, and electrical work. So it's important that you have a clear understanding of everything that goes into your tiny house beyond materials and labor. So if you're considering building a tiny house, I hope this video gives you a better understanding of all the factors and costs associated with a tiny house build. By considering these factors and finding ways to save money, you can build a tiny house that fits your budget and meets all your needs. Of course, building a tiny house is a big undertaking, so make sure you are prepared to do so, because believe me, you are going to have challenges along the way. But with careful planning and a little bit of creativity, you can turn your tiny house dreams into a reality. If you have any comments or questions about tiny house cost, or if you have some of your own personal tips on how you save money on your tiny house build, please let us know. We would really love to know what you did, and it would just bring a lot of value to other people who are looking to build a tiny house themselves. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.